For our final project for modern Latin American history, we chose to do a podcast. In this podcast, we'll be talking about neoliberalism and its effect on 4 different Latin American countries. My name is Nick Garcia, and I'll be talking about neoliberalism and plurinationalism in Bolivia.
My name is Buster Couhig, and I'll be talking about the implementation of neoliberal policies in Chile during the dictatorship of General Pinochet.
I'm Dakota Gordon, and I'll be talking about Argentinian neoliberalism.
My name is Byron Newman, and I will be talking about the historical themes of neoliberalism and democracy in the country of Brazil.
So to start us off, I found a quote from one of the readings we did that I thought defined neoliberalism very well. It was from George Monbiot, and it reads, "Neoliberalism sees competition as the defining characteristic of human relations. It redefines citizens as consumers whose democratic choices are best exercised by buying and selling, a process that rewards merit and punishes inefficiency. It maintains that the market delivers benefits that could never be achieved by planning."
So what really is neoliberalism? We kind of broke it down into 3 different parts. It advocates for free market, limited government intervention in the economy, and privatization of different industries. For the free market, it kind of stresses the importance of free markets in order to allocate resources and promotes little government intervention within the economy, which results in competition among the people, which promotes a healthier economy. Second, deregulation reduces government regulations on business transactions, which encourages innovation and growth within the economy, making it easier for people to get into and out of different markets, and removes governmental interference. Third, and finally, we're talking about privatization within neoliberalism, which is the push to make state-owned assets such as transportation, healthcare, and water supply part of a private sector, which means private ownership and management by certain citizens, kind of giving them full control over what goes on there. And that kind of improves the efficiency of the economy, lowers government spending, and fosters a healthy economy because of the competition introduced by privatization.
So looking at all of these things combined and looking at our respective companies, we kind of came up with an overarching question, which is, how has neoliberalism shaped the political, economic, and social landscapes of Latin America, and what have been its most significant consequences across different governmental contexts? So I looked at Chile, and I was looking at the neoliberal policies in Chile during the dictatorship in Pinochet and tried to correlate the economic outcomes and the social costs. So first, to give some context, in 1973, following a military coup supported by the U.S., General Pinochet came into power, which marked the start of a pretty harsh regime that would last for nearly 2 decades. This period saw the rapid implementation of neoliberalism in terms of economic reforms, which were spearheaded by the Chicago Boys, who were a group of Chilean economists. And these reforms included massive privatization of state-owned industries, deregulation of the economy, and reduction of trade barriers. The Chicago Boys really believed that free market policies would correct economic inefficiencies and lead to growth. And their influence was so profound that in the 1980 Constitution, which they helped make, it enshrined the principles of a market-driven economy, which severely limited the state's role in economic matters. So the outcomes that came from this were a mix of economic highs and lows. On one hand, Chile experienced significant reductions in inflation and also some spurts of high growth, which were particularly evident in sectors like agriculture. However, these policies also led to severe social costs. The shock treatment approach, which included drastic cuts in public spending, resulted in widespread unemployment and a sharp increase in poverty rates. There were tons of social costs. The regime's harsh measures weren't entirely limited to the economy. The enforcement of these policies occurred in an environment of severe political repression. Human rights violations were rampant, dissent was crushed, and the public's ability to protest or strike was virtually non-existent. Interestingly enough, even though the economic policies were radical, the expected benefits like sustained high growth and equitable wealth distribution did not materialize as they promised. The economy suffered from a devastating recession in 1982, and income inequality reached levels that were extraordinarily high even for South America. While proponents of neoliberalism argue that the policies implemented underneath Pinochet laid the groundwork for Chile's economic stability and growth that came after, it's really important to remember the significant and social and human costs that were paid. These reforms were achieved in the context of a dictatorship that did not tolerate opposition, which is a fact that profoundly affected their legitimacy and the fabric of Chilean society. And while looking at Chile, it's very important to question whether the economic gains were worth the human costs and to explore how these policies continue to influence Chile today.
I thought that the Chicago boys were super interesting, that they like paid for them to go to school in America, and then they came back and had like such a profound impact on the government. They were essentially like telling the president what to do and like what to implement. So I thought that was super interesting. So now I'm going to talk about Argentina. So like generally speaking, it was implemented under President Menem in the 80s and 90s, and similar to what happened in Chile, they essentially just like privatized a lot of the state-owned enterprises. In Argentina, it was telecommunications, electricity, gas, water service, and all of that. Essentially what they did is they pegged the Argentinian peso to the U.S. dollar, and that was in the convertibility plan in 1991. So essentially what that means is the Argentinian peso was directly dependent on the U.S. dollar, so pretty much whatever happened with inflation in the U.S. also happened in Argentina, which is super bad for countries that aren't like global players because they're really put in an inferior role where they're dependent on other countries. Initially, they thought it was going to have a positive impact, like stabilizing inflation and attracting foreign investors, but the long-term repercussions were a lot of unemployment, debt, and then they once again were just reliant on the global economy. And then when looking at neoliberalism in Argentina, I referenced the song we listened to in class, Los Métodos Piqueteros, and I thought that was a super interesting song because it was kind of about the Piquetero movement, which was, you know, a form of resistance against neoliberalism, and the song itself described not only like historical figures that were involved in Argentina, but also like the specific things they did. It was kind of like a rallying cry for the people. And then eventually the neoliberalist policies culminated in the 2001 economic crisis. And the causes of that were just like extensive borrowing, fiscal deficits, and then the pegging of the currency. And it led to bank runs and massive protests, which was referenced in the song. And then there's just a rapid succession of presidents in deviation from neoliberal policies after that, because everyone was kind of put away by what happened in Argentina.
I also think it's really important to note, especially in Argentina, that neoliberalism is very appealing at the start when you're looking at the economic growth and stability that it can promise. But what a lot of people don't see at first is that it's very short-lived in its implementation, really, in Argentina. And that kind of showed a sharp rise in their inequality and increased susceptibility to outside shocks, which, I mean, that just, like, the external shocks you can't control really determine what your economy looks like at the end of the day.
Yeah, so I kind of think through our initial thoughts, there's kind of a developing theme of protests and pushback from people against neoliberalism. I'm going to talk about Bolivia now, and I'll dive deeper into that in a little bit. But in Bolivia, kind of once they adopted these neoliberalism kind of ideas, they experienced significant challenges, and the responses to neoliberal policies were pretty negative. The neoliberalism was heavily promoted internationally by financial institutions like the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund. And that was as a solution to the economic crises that were kind of introduced due to the neoliberalistic kind of ideas that were implemented within the economy. And like I said before in our introduction, the specific reforms that were kind of included in the neoliberalism kind of idea included privatization of state-owned industries, like your typical water kind of supply or your transportation, deregulation of markets, which kind of pulls government interference out and kind of allows the people to freely kind of experience, your quote-unquote free market. reduction of public spending, and trade liberalization. But however, although that might seem like it's taking positive steps for the economy, the implementation of these policies brought about new issues that were just as detrimental to the economy and kind of the people's well-being, like inequality, poverty, and kind of just some social unrest, kind of talking about these pushbacks and kind of standoffs that people were having. So these reforms kind of led to ultimate discontent among the population, particularly among the indigenous and impoverished communities. They suffered the most, typically, because of the changes that were implemented, like tax increases, which obviously they're not making as much money as the higher elites, so that's less affordable for them. Spending cuts on government, which kind of leaves the people on their own to kind of figure some things out, like healthcare, or if there was a free transportation kind of implemented within the community and that was pulled out, that kind of leaves the impoverished at a disadvantage, and also kind of just impacts on the market liberalization. The privatization of the key industries such as the water and natural gas industries kind of sparked protests and social movements. One that was most notable to me when I was doing my research was the Cochabamba water war in the 2000s, where the citizens kind of stepped out and pushed back against the government and who were trying to privatize the water industry, and the citizens were ultimately successful in stopping that. In late December of 1999 through early April 2000, in response to that, the city was trying to privatize the municipal water supply. The company was called Semapa, and the wave of demonstrations of kind of protests and police violence that was ultimately shown during those times kind of led to reform.
Yeah, and as Nick was stating in his talk, a big reason a large percentage of individuals are against and oppose the neoliberalism actions is because it can heavily favor the individuals without power, the ones who are impoverished, which is why neoliberalism may not thrive, and honestly, the upper class have more control regarding political action throughout history. So I will be diving into the historical themes of neoliberalism in the country of Brazil, a country with a volatile political landscape. So a new era of democracy and neoliberal development began in 1991, led by Fernando Collor, who was elected president this year and assisted in Brazil's association with Mercosur, or the Southern Common Market, where they joined Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay in the trade organization, lowering trade barriers, neoliberalism concept. This was necessary for economic reform as Brazil's inflation had climbed to 1,585%, which is a massive inflation percentage. And as discussed in our class slides and class discussion, Fernando Collor desired to have Brazil agree to the Washington Consensus, which would allow them to gain stability by being associated with the International Monetary Fund, which Nick previously touched on, the World Bank, and U.S. Department of Treasury. This would provide stability for the Brazilian economy. However, his proposal was rejected, and Collor was impeached in 1992, however re-elected from 1995 to 2002. In 2003, Luiz Inácio, or Lula da Silva, was elected president of Brazil and aimed to implement neoliberalism policies to aid the impoverished population and lower the extreme poverty rates that were negatively affecting Brazil. Lula could be seen as a positive leader for Brazil, as he was a former factory worker and could relate to the general population of Brazil. Under Lula, the Bolsa Familia program was implemented. This program stated that government finances would be given to families at a rate of per child, as long as they were vaccinated and enrolled in school. There were positive results from the Bolsa Familia program. The highly impoverished class, titled Social Class E, decreased from 31% to 18% of the population. The unemployment rate fell from 12.3% to 6.7%, with an estimated job creation total of 15 million. It also resulted in a large improvement in female enrollment in education, as the population rate of a 15-year-old female in school rose 21%. It appeared that the neoliberal development in Brazil resulting in improvement of all resulted in improvement of all aspects of the country, until the corruption and greed surrounding political leaders became revealed. Lula was convicted in 2017 for money laundering and was put in jail. His successor and political associate Dilma Rousseff was impeached due to her link with Lula's government-funded kickbacks and misleading schemes. This unfortunately led to an economic and political downfall after the brief progress that the country experienced, and fascist, malicious president Jair Bolsonaro achieved power from 2019 to 2022. He admired the former dictatorships throughout Latin America and had previous public statements which reflect horribly upon him and, in turn, the country of Brazil. These statements include the dictatorship mistake was to torture but not kill, and Pinochet should have killed more people, which he verbalized in regard to former Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet. Saying that the Brazilian population had a strong distaste for Bolsonaro would be a bold understatement, and Lula da Silva was actually made a return from prisoner to president as he was reelected in 2023. Lula had success with his neoliberal policies in his previous tenure and hoped to bring Brazil out of the economic slum it is currently in today. He promised to increase minimum wage, and in Lula's brief return to his tenure in 2023, Brazil's GDP growth exceeded expectations as it rose by 2.9%, along with the country poverty rate dropping from 23.5% in 2022 to 21.3% in 2023, as reported by theworldbank.org. And although high poverty, economic insufficiency, and political division are widely present in the country of Brazil, the lead of left-wing Luiz Inácio and his neoliberal policies show a sense of promise for the future.
Yeah, and in a semi-similar way to Byron's thoughts about Brazil and the change in leadership, Bolivia experienced a similar change in leadership which caused major change, just like it happened in Brazil, as Byron mentioned, but this time it was for the better. In 2006, Evo Morales was elected the president of Bolivia. He led the Movement for Socialism party and kind of was backed by Bolivia's indigenous people, who were the same people fighting against the neoliberalistic kind of ideas that were in place at that moment. And he kind of promised to relieve them of their struggle and kind of push for them to have better quality of life. And in 2009, Bolivia introduced a new constitution that was introduced by Evo Morales, and it kind of took the country, it was a turning point for the country. It moved away from neoliberalism and introduced plurinationalism. Specifics from this included granting indigenous groups greater autonomy and representation in government, which they had been striving for a long time. And also emphasized the importance of the indigenous culture within Bolivia. It recognized the importance of their language, their customs and traditions, and ultimately Morales sought to kind of create a more inclusive and diverse national identity for Bolivia to kind of include all of the citizens, including the indigenous persons that were living there. Under Morales' leadership, Bolivia made significant strides in the poverty sector, seeing major reductions in poverty, expanding health care and education, which were two key problems that were kind of happening and being dealt with, and seeing major pushback from the people during the neoliberalistic times. Yeah.
I think that now we can go to more of a discussion of the similarities and differences between all four of the countries. I think that a common theme between all of them is neoliberalism is a short-term solution for a long-term problem, meaning that in the short term, like when it's first implemented, it seems good and, inflation goes down and maybe there's some economic benefits, but inevitably in all of these countries, I think it led to, protests and a downfall. And I think neoliberalism, generally speaking, favors, as other people have said, the elites of the country, the people that have power and have money, but the people who are preferably like boots on the ground, like actually, being negatively impacted by this, their lives are pretty much turned upside down. I think that's just, a common theme that we all found from our individual research.
Yeah, adding on to what Dakota said, I would say honestly, most outcomes in the case of neoliberal implementation find the same conclusion, an unhappy population and a dwindling economy. And in Chile, this was clear through the prolonged illegitimacy of the dictatorship, which, I mean, it's also clear that, like, the Bolivarian ideals that were strong in the population, like reform and stuff like that, combined with the external shocks that couldn't be dealt with, like the shock treatment that we saw in Chile, directly paved the grounds for the collapse of neoliberal ideas.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. When it comes to Bolivia, kind of you see on the front is neoliberalistic ideas that are implemented within the community. There's a certain class of people or social group that has some sort of issue with it. And in my case, it was the impoverished and indigenous. They kind of pushed back, showed out, and kind of protested against the matters that meant the most to them, that were having the biggest effect on their lives and kind of their quality of life. And that ultimately led to the election of the new leader in the 2006, Morales, and then he kind of sparked the change based on the needs and wants of the indigenous people especially, and then also including the impoverished.
Yes, similar to as what Nick previously said, to piggyback off him, it is definitely hard to find a balance and maintain the neoliberal policies for a lengthy time. As shown in Brazil, it hasn't been able to be upheld for decades at a time. It can unfortunately cause tension between the social classes, leading to a disrupt in unity across the individual countries and across Latin America as a whole, as I think unity and harmony across the Latin American entities would definitely be beneficial for their culture and political and economic structures.
Yeah, I think like when you talk about like dependency theory and just like the world as a whole, these countries kind of get pushed to the side. And like in my case for Argentina, like pegging their currency to, the U.S.'s currency, like it might have controlled inflation in the short term, but it really makes it hard for countries to like make their own way because they're so dependent on like the U.S., which is obviously at the time the biggest country in the world. And I think that that's like one of the main things that is a negative impact on these countries.
And analyzing Latin America as a whole, these are countries who have historically been controlled, infiltrated by the United States and other entities, and have not reacted well to invasive and controlling political structures. And I believe that this has made it difficult for the neoliberal policies to thrive for a significant time period.
Yeah, kind of backpacking off of that and wrapping up a little bit, it's really clear that while these policies have honestly shaped the way for the economic landscapes of these nations, they've also left indelible marks on their social fabrics, which I think is one of the most important conclusions to come to. From Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile to the democratic transitions in Argentina and the plurinational push in Bolivia, the implementation and effects of neoliberalism have varied significantly. Each case reveals a really complex interplay between economic theories and political realities, between market efficiencies and social equity. And as we continue to see the evolution of these policies and their long-term impacts, it becomes increasingly important to assess not just the economic outcomes, but the human cost and the voices that are marginalized in these high-stake economic transformations. This exploration through our podcast hasn't only highlighted diverse perspectives, but it also really underscores the debate on the role and reach of neoliberalism in shaping the futures of the nations. I want to thank you for a great semester, and thank you for listening to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for tuning in and for a great semester. I think that this was a nice culmination for all of us, and it was super fun getting to do this on essay in the form of a podcast. I think we all had a great time, and it was fun sitting here and talking about what we learned.
Yeah, this was a different kind of unconventional way to kind of do some research and kind of show off what we learned throughout the semesters, especially the second half of the semester. So I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for tuning in, Professor.
Same message as well. Thank you very much for tuning in. I believe this modern Latin American history course, from it, I have been able to develop a more worldly view, and I've enjoyed this podcast experience, a new experience for me.
Thanks, Professor.
Thank you.
Stay